The first thing I noticed was the sun glare off my front window, that harsh desert light bouncing off pale stucco and gravel beds, the kind of morning where everything looks overexposed. I was halfway through coffee when the idea hit me that something felt off, the quiet kind of off that usually comes before trouble. The question that kept looping was simple and sharp. Would a $1,200 fine really stick if proof surfaced by Monday, or was this just another power flex wrapped in official letterhead? I didn't know it yet, but the answer was already taped to my door, fluttering in the warm breeze. I live in a planned desert suburb where the lawns are more symbolic than practical, thin strips of green framed by rock gardens and drought-tolerant shrubs. The association sells the image of order and calm, a curated calm where rules are supposed to keep peace rather than provoke it. That morning, the peace felt brittle. I remember the faint hum of a distant leaf blower and the smell of hot asphalt starting early, like the day itself was impatient. I hadn't even opened the door when I sensed a shift. The notice was a single sheet, bright white against the tan paint, stamped with the association's logo and the words "Final Courtesy Warning" in bold. It cited lawn color noncompliance and referenced a follow-up inspection scheduled before Monday. The fine amount wasn't yet listed, but the implication was clear and the timeline was tight. I stood there reading it twice, feeling the heat rise not just from the sidewalk but in my chest, because my lawn was compliant, measured, documented, and boringly within every guideline they'd published. This wasn't my first brush with the committee, but it was the first time the stakes felt personal and public. In neighborhoods like ours, notices are a form of social currency, a way to signal who's in line and who's not. The idea that my yard was suddenly too green felt absurd, almost comical, except the consequences were very real. A $1,200 fine would hurt, but the real cost would be the whisper network, the slow erosion of standing among neighbors who watched quietly from behind blinds. To understand why that paper mattered so much, you have to understand the background, the culture baked into this place. Our association prides itself on uniformity, not beauty, and certainly not comfort. The rules are thick, printed on glossy paper, and written in a tone that pretends to be friendly while threatening penalties in the margins. Lawn color is governed by a narrow range of approved hues, tied to seasonal allowances and irrigation schedules that change quarterly. It's the kind of rule that seems harmless until someone decides to enforce it creatively. The enforcer in this case wasn't an abstract board vote or a faceless inspector. It was a woman neighbors whispered about, the type who carried a clipboard like a badge. She wasn't technically on the board, but she acted as an extension of it, volunteering for inspections and reporting issues, with a zeal that made people tense when they saw her walking the sidewalks. Her reputation preceded her, and that reputation was built on small victories, petty citations, and the satisfaction of compliance. My lawn had been a point of pride only because it was deliberately unremarkable. I followed the irrigation schedule to the minute, used approved seed blends, and even kept receipts for pigment additives recommended by the association's own landscaping guide. The desert sun bleaches everything, so maintaining even a modest green requires attention, but I'd never pushed it beyond the rules. If anything, my grass was duller than some, which is why the accusation felt targeted. The notice referenced a preliminary observation made during a routine walkthrough, followed by a scheduled inspection. It cited the association's aesthetic standards without specifying which threshold I'd crossed. That vagueness was intentional, a way to keep the upper hand while applying pressure. The date on the notice read May 14th, and the follow-up was set before the end of the weekend. The clock was already ticking. I took photos immediately, standing back to capture the lawn in context, the neighboring yards, the angle of the sun. The light was unforgiving, casting sharp shadows from the low desert trees, and I knew photos could lie as easily as they could prove truth. Still, evidence mattered. This was my first instinct, born from previous skirmishes where documentation had been the difference between a warning and a fine. The deadline loomed, and with each hour that passed, the threat of escalation grew heavier, because this wasn't just about grass. It was about control, about who got to decide what was acceptable and who paid when the line moved. As the day wore on, I started pulling out old emails, archived newsletters, and the thick binder I kept in a hall closet, the one labeled HOA with a kind of grim humor. Inside were printed guidelines, amendments, and a copy of the aesthetic standards highlighted in places that had once seemed theoretical. Lawn color guidelines were tucked into Section 4, with a chart that allowed for seasonal variation and noted that pigment saturation could fluctuate based on sunlight and water quality. I remembered attending a community meeting months earlier where this exact issue had come up. Someone had asked about lawns appearing greener after rain, and the board had shrugged it off, saying enforcement would be reasonable. Reasonable is a flexible word. The memory of that meeting, the faint echo of folding chairs scraping on tile and the dry air humming through vents, now felt like foreshadowing. The enforcers' patrols were known to intensify when someone pushed back, and I hadn't even pushed yet. The idea that inspections could escalate, that inspectors might start measuring saturation or comparing yards side by side, made my stomach knot. In this neighborhood, being singled out often led to a cascade of discoveries, each one justifiable on paper. I decided to get ahead of it. I printed my irrigation logs, showing adherence to the schedule down to the minute, and pulled receipts for the approved pigment additive, complete with the association's own recommendation highlighted. I even found an old board agenda excerpt from last summer where lawn color enforcement had been discussed, the language emphasizing consistency and fairness. Evidence prop number 1, quietly waiting to be used. The sensory details of that afternoon are burned into my memory, the cicadas buzzing as the heat peaked, the smell of dust and cut grass mixing in the air. Neighbors passed by with polite waves, their eyes lingering just a second longer than usual on my yard, as if they already knew. Word travels fast when a clipboard is involved. By early evening, a second notice appeared in my inbox, this one an automated reminder about the upcoming inspection. It was impersonal, but the timing felt aggressive. The message referenced potential fines up to $1,200 for continued noncompliance, a number designed to shock more than inform. I could almost feel the satisfaction on the other end, the belief that pressure would force me to cave. This was where the conflict truly began to rise, shifting from an annoyance to a test of will. I wasn't interested in a shouting match or a dramatic confrontation. This was going to be quieter, slower, and far more meticulous. The association thrived on vague authority. My response would be specificity. I walked the lawn again as the sun dipped, the light turning everything gold for a moment before fading. The grass looked the same as it always had, a modest green framed by gravel and succulents, nothing flashy. I took more photos, this time with a color calibration card in the frame, a trick I'd learned from a photographer friend. It felt excessive, but excess was the language the association understood. As Monday crept closer, the risk wasn't just the money. It was the potential for public shaming, the quiet nods and whispered judgments that followed a citation. If they wanted theater, I was starting to plan my own. The chapter of my story closed that night with a sense of uneasy resolve. I had my documents lined up, my evidence ready, and a growing suspicion that this wasn't about compliance at all. The desert air cooled, the neighborhood settled into its artificial calm, and I knew the next inspection would change everything. The inspection came sooner than I expected, arriving with the quiet inevitability of heat at noon. I wasn't home when it happened, which felt intentional, as if presence might complicate the narrative. When I pulled into the driveway later, the desert sky was a bleached blue, and the air shimmered above the pavement. There was no new notice on the door, just a faint sense of having been watched, measured, judged. By that evening, the email landed. The association acknowledged receipt of my previous correspondence, a phrase that neatly ignored the substance of what I'd sent, and stated that further review was underway. It mentioned discrepancies between my lawn's appearance and approved standards, without specifying what those discrepancies were. The language was careful, almost smug, and it ended with a reminder that fines could be assessed retroactively. The implied message was clear. They believed they still held all the cards. This was the point where escalation became obvious. The enforcer wasn't satisfied with a warning. She wanted a result, something visible and corrective. In communities like this, enforcement often feeds on momentum. Once a target is chosen, Backing down feels like losing face. I could sense that the association was preparing to double down, to turn my lawn into an example. I responded with restraint, attaching a concise packet of documentation. Irrigation logs. Receipts. The highlighted section of the aesthetic standards. I referenced the notice dated May 14th and asked, politely, for clarification on which measurable threshold I had exceeded. The act of asking for specifics can feel confrontational in a system built on ambiguity. I knew that.
The deadline loomed larger now, and with it the risk of money at stake, a four-figure fine hovering like a threat meant to force submission. The next few days were a study in tension. Each morning, I stepped outside half expecting another paper taped to the door, the sound of it fluttering in the breeze like an accusation. Instead, there was silence, which felt worse. Silence meant deliberation, emails exchanged behind closed doors, opinions solidifying without my input. Neighbors began to ask questions in roundabout ways. Someone commented on how healthy my lawn looked, their tone carefully neutral. Another mentioned hearing that inspections were getting stricter this season. No one said my name outright, but the implication hung in the air. Social pressure is a subtle weapon. It doesn't need to be loud to be effective. I kept documenting. Each watering cycle was logged, each change in light photographed. I even took samples of the grass, laying them against a printed color chart from the association's own guide. It felt absurd, crouching in the yard with scissors while the sun beat down, but absurdity was part of the process. If they wanted proof, I would drown them in it. By midweek, the association escalated again. A formal violation notice appeared in my account portal, listing lawn color noncompliance and scheduling a compliance deadline. The fine was now explicit, $1,200 if the issue wasn't resolved by Monday. There it was, no longer implied. The notice referenced the same vague standards and added a line about community aesthetics and property values. It was a familiar refrain, one designed to frame enforcement as altruism. The sensory details of that moment are sharp. The whir of the ceiling fan as I read the notice on my laptop, the faint smell of dust from events, the heat pressing in even indoors. This was no longer a misunderstanding. It was a standoff. This marked the end of the early conflict and the beginning of full escalation. I requested a hearing, citing my right to appeal before fines were assessed. The response was curt but affirmative, scheduling a review before the board. The date landed just days away, adding another layer of urgency. In preparation, I expanded my evidence. I pulled water usage statements from the utility, showing consistency with approved limits. I printed the board agenda excerpt I'd saved, the one emphasizing reasonable enforcement. Evidence prop number 2 was now ready, reinforcing the first. The theme was consistency. If the association wanted uniformity, I would show that I embodied it. The enforcer's presence became more noticeable. I spotted her more than once at the end of the street, clipboard in hand, her posture unmistakable even at a distance. Each sighting tightened the knot in my stomach, but it also clarified my resolve. This wasn't about grass. It was about demonstrating authority. As the review date approached, the threat shifted from money to reputation, the possibility of being labeled non-compliant in front of neighbors who would never hear the full STO. The hearing itself was a study in controlled tension. I attended virtually. The board members framed in small boxes on my screen, their backgrounds revealing tasteful art and neutral walls. The enforcer wasn't officially part of the meeting, but her influence was palpable in the language used to describe the violation. I presented my documentation calmly, walking through each piece without embellishment. Irrigation logs, receipts, color charts. I referenced the notice dated May 14th and asked again for the specific metric I had failed. The response was evasive, focusing on visual assessment rather than measurable criteria. That was the crack I'd been waiting for. The board deferred a decision, stating they would review the materials and follow up. It was a non-answer, but it bought me time. Time mattered. Time allowed patterns to emerge, inconsistencies to be noticed. In the days that followed, I learned that other homeowners had received similar warnings, though none as severe. The enforcement was uneven, selective. This was evidence of a different kind, social rather than documentary, and it hinted at a broader issue. I began quietly comparing notes, not organizing anything overt, just listening. The clock kept ticking, and with each delay, the potential for legal consequence loomed larger, not because I was wrong, but because the system resisted admitting it. Another email arrived, this one announcing a reinspection. No explanation, no acknowledgement of my appeal, just a new date. It felt like a tactic, a way to reset the narrative and reassert control. I prepared again, photographing the lawn under different light conditions, noting cloud cover and time of day. The desert sky cooperated, shifting from harsh brightness to muted overcast, a rare gift. The reinspection passed without comment, but the aftermath didn't. A revised notice appeared, maintaining the violation and reiterating the fine amount. The language had changed slightly, now referencing community complaints. That caught my attention. Complaints meant names, or at least sources, and those could be questioned. This was where escalation peaked. The association wasn't backing down, it was entrenching. The fine was no longer just a threat, it was imminent. My response would have to change. The association accused my compliant lawn of violating vague color standards and threatened a $1,200 fine despite detailed documentation and a pending appeal. With inspections increasing and deadlines tightening, the dispute shifted from misunderstanding to deliberate enforcement pressure. Armed with that clarity, I began planning the next phase. This wasn't about arguing anymore. It was about exposing the weakness in their process. I requested, formally, the records of community complaints referenced in the notice. I asked for the criteria used during inspections and the training inspectors received. These were reasonable requests, but I knew they would be inconvenient. The response was delayed, then partial. Redacted summaries were provided, vague and unhelpful. That in itself was telling. Transparency wasn't their strength. I added these responses to my growing file, evidence prop number 3, illustrating procedural inconsistency. As the calendar edged toward the compliance deadline, the stakes sharpened again, and the possibility of turning their own rules against them started to feel R. This is where Module 2 comes to a pause, right on the edge of action. The fine deadline was days away. My documentation was thorough. The association's position was rigid. The desert nights grew cooler, the days no less bright, and beneath the manufactured calm of the neighborhood, tension simmered. The next move would decide whether this stayed a citation or became something far more public. The shift from defense to retaliation didn't happen all at once. It began quietly, with me rereading the association's own documents late at night, the soft tick of the wall clock marking time as the desert cooled outside. If the committee wanted strict adherence, then strict adherence was exactly what they were going to get, just not in the way they expected. This wasn't about breaking rules. It was about following them so precisely that the enforcement itself would collapse under scrutiny. I started by requesting a formal color assessment using the association's approved vendor list. The guidelines mentioned approved vendors in passing, usually ignored because visual inspections were cheaper and faster. I insisted on the process outlined, citing the exact paragraph where third-party confirmation was permitted. The request was framed as cooperation, not challenge, but the effect was immediate. Delays followed. Emails slowed. The machinery hesitated. At the same time, I adjusted nothing about the lawn. No watering changes, no pigment tweaks. The grass remained exactly as it had been during every inspection. This mattered, because consistency would expose contradiction. If the color was truly non-compliant, it would remain so under any assessment. If not, the narrative would unravel. With the fine deadline approaching, money was still on the line, but now the association risked something else, being forced to justify its own procedures in writing. The third-party assessment took place on a bright morning, the light clean and sharp after a rare overnight breeze. The vendor photographed the lawn, compared samples to the approved chart, and logged saturation readings. I stayed out of the way, listening to the distant sound of traffic and the soft rustle of palm fronds, resisting the urge to hover. This wasn't a performance, it was documentation. When the report arrived, it was anticlimactic in the best way. The lawn fell within acceptable range for the season, with a note that color variation could be influenced by sun exposure and reflective surfaces nearby. In other words, normal desert conditions. I forwarded the report to the association immediately, attaching my previous evidence again, neatly organized. The response took longer than usual. When it came, it was defensive, acknowledging the report but stating that the board would still deliberate. Deliberation, at this point, felt like stalling. I reminded them politely that the compliance deadline was approaching and asked whether the fine would be suspended pending review. That question forced a choice. The answer arrived the next day. The fine would be paused. Not canceled, just paused. It was a partial retreat, and it confirmed what I'd suspected all along. The enforcement had overreached, and now they needed a way to save face. This was the opening I'd been preparing for. I requested that the violation be formally dismissed based on the vendor's findings and asked that my account be noted as compliant. I also asked, almost as an afterthought, whether similar assessments would be offered to other homeowners cited under the same criteria. That last question was the lever. The risk now wasn't financial, it was institutional, because consistency demanded either broader change or an admission of selective enforcement. The climax came not with a dramatic announcement, but with an updated account statement. The violation was gone. The balance showed zero due. No apology accompanied it, just a brief note that the matter had been resolved. I sat at my desk, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the room, and let the moment settle. It was satisfying in a quiet, precise way, the kind that comes from preparation rather than confrontation. But the story didn't end there. Weeks later, the association circulated an updated memo about lawn inspections, clarifying procedures and emphasizing the use of measurable standards. It read like policy, but I could see the fingerprints of this dispute all over it. The enforcers' patrols became less frequent. The clipboard appeared less often. This wasn't revenge in the cinematic sense. No one was publicly shamed. No speeches were made. The satisfaction came from watching a system adjust because it had been forced to confront its own flaws. It was a small win, but it rippled outward. In the aftermath, neighbors approached me quietly, asking how I'd handled it. I shared my process without drama, emphasizing documentation and patience. The social temperature cooled. Lawns remained lawns. The desert suburb returned to its curated calm, though something underneath had shifted. Authority felt a little less absolute. The cost was time and stress, but the benefit was clarity. I learned that in an HOA nightmare, the most effective response isn't anger, it's precision. That lesson stuck with me, and it reshaped how I viewed every rule posted on the community bulletin. Tell me your HOA lawn or find horror in one lane. As I wrapped up this chapter, I couldn't help but think about the next battle brewing somewhere nearby. Another homeowner staring at a notice and wondering if compliance would ever be enough. In communities like this, the line between order and overreach is thin, and someone is always testing it. The next story picks up where this one leaves off, with a different rule, a different target, and the same quiet question of how far is too far.